Story 1. The Mirror Rig. Jake Torrance had been hauling freight across the Midwest for 17 years, and in all that time he'd developed certain routines that kept him sane on those endless stretches of highway. He knew every truck stop between Chicago and Denver, every way station, every spot where the state troopers liked to hide. He drove a 2015 Peterbilt 579, midnight blue with chrome accents that he kept polished to perfection. His CB handle was Blue Thunder, and he took pride in being one of the reliable voices on Channel 19, always ready with traffic updates or weather warnings for his fellow drivers. It was March 14, 2019, when Jake picked up a load of agricultural equipment in Des Moines, Iowa, headed for a farm supply warehouse outside of North Platte, Nebraska. The manifest listed combines, tillers, and irrigation parts, nothing unusual. The weather forecast called for clear skies, and he planned to make the run in about 7 hours with one fuel stop. He left the distribution center at 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The first 3 hours passed without incident. Jake listened to a true crime podcast, ate the turkey sandwich his wife had packed for him, and watched the Iowa farmland gradually transition into the rolling plains of Nebraska. He stopped at a Flying J just past the state line, topped off his diesel tanks, grabbed a coffee, and used the restroom. By the time he pulled back onto Interstate 80, darkness had settled completely over the landscape. The highway stretched before him like a black ribbon, his headlights cutting through the night. Around 9 o'clock, Jake noticed another semi in his mirrors. It was unusual because he hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 20 minutes. Out here, traffic was sparse after dark, especially midweek. The truck appeared to be the same make and model as his own, a Peterbilt 579, and as it drew closer, Jake could see that it was also painted midnight blue. The coincidence made him chuckle. He'd never seen another rig quite like his own. The truck maintained a steady distance behind him, maybe 200 yards back. Jake tried to get a look at the driver when the other truck pulled into the passing lane, but the cab was too dark to make out any details. What he could see, however, made his skin prickle with an inexplicable unease. The truck was identical to his in every visible way. Same model year, same paint color, same chrome package, even the same bug shield on the hood. The coincidence seemed to stretch beyond probability into something else entirely. Jake keyed his CB radio. "Hey there, driver behind me in the blue Pete. You got your ears on?" Static answered him. He tried again. "Blue Peterbilt, this is Blue Thunder. Come back if you're listening." Still nothing but the hiss and crackle of empty airwaves. The other truck continued to pace him, neither gaining nor falling back, maintaining that exact distance as if tethered by an invisible rope. For the next 30 miles, the situation remained unchanged. The mirror truck, as Jake had started thinking of it, followed at precisely the same speed. When Jake accelerated to 75, the other truck matched him. When he slowed to 65, so did his shadow. He tried adjusting his mirrors to get a better look at the driver, but the angle was wrong, and the darkness made it impossible to see through the windshield of the following vehicle. The unease that had started as a mild curiosity began to transform into something heavier, more oppressive. Jake had driven millions of miles in his career, and he'd developed what he thought of as a sixth sense for when something wasn't right. That internal alarm was ringing now, growing louder with each passing mile. He decided to test his shadow. At mile marker 215, Jake took his foot off the accelerator and let his rig coast, gradually reducing speed. He watched his speedometer drop from 70 to 65, then to 60, 55, 50. The truck behind him decelerated at exactly the same rate, maintaining that unchanging distance. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He pressed the accelerator again, bringing his speed back up to 70, then 75, then 80. His shadow matched him perfectly, as if they were connected by some invisible synchronization. Jake grabbed his CB again. "Any drivers out there on I-80 westbound? This is Blue Thunder at mile marker 217. Anybody got a copy?" He waited, hoping for a response, any voice to break the isolation. A crackle of static, then a voice responded, but it made Jake's blood run cold. It was his own voice, speaking his exact words, but delayed by perhaps 2 seconds, like an echo. "Any drivers out there on I-80 westbound? This is Blue Thunder at mile marker 217. Anybody got a copy?" He dropped the microphone as if it had burned him. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. He thought about pulling over, forcing a confrontation with whoever was driving that other truck, but something deep in his gut told him that would be a mistake. Some primal instinct warned him that stopping would be the worst thing he could do. The highway continued to unspool before him, and Jake became aware of other details that seemed wrong. The mile markers were passing too slowly. He checked his speedometer, 73 miles per hour, but the markers seemed to appear at odd intervals. Mile marker 220 appeared, then 221. But it seemed like too much time passed before 222 emerged from the darkness. He checked his odometer and did the math in his head. Something was off with the distance. Then he noticed something else. His fuel gauge hadn't moved. He'd been driving for over an hour since his last stop, and at 70+ miles per hour, his rig should have burned through at least a quarter tank. The needle still showed 3/4 full, exactly where it had been at the truck stop. Jake tapped the gauge, wondering if it was stuck, but it didn't budge. The mirror truck remained in position, a constant presence in his rearview mirrors. Jake tried the CB one more time. "This isn't funny. Whoever you are, back off." His own voice answered again, delayed and hollow sounding. "This isn't funny. Whoever you are, back off." Panic began to set in. Jake's breathing came faster and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air flowing from his vents. He looked at his GPS unit, hoping to see how far he was from North Platte, but the screen showed something impossible. According to the GPS, he was still at mile marker 215, exactly where he'd been when he first noticed the problem with his shadow. But he'd driven at least 20 miles since then. He'd watched the mile markers pass. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his speed to 85, then 90. The truck behind him matched his acceleration perfectly. The highway seemed to narrow, the darkness pressing in from both sides. Jake realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen an exit sign or an overpass. The road had become a featureless tunnel of asphalt and painted lines, stretching endlessly forward and backward. Mile marker 215 appeared in his headlights. Again, the same marker he'd passed over and over. Jake's mind reeled. He'd been driving for what felt like hours, burning fuel and covering distance. But somehow he was trapped at this one point on the highway, driving in a loop that made no physical sense. He looked at his clock, 9:47 p.m. He looked again several minutes later by his perception, 9:47 p.m. Time had stopped, or he'd fallen out of it somehow. Jake's hands trembled on the wheel. He thought of his wife, his 2 daughters, his home in Rockford. Would he ever see them again? Was he going to spend eternity on this impossible stretch of highway, shadowed by a mirror version of himself? The CB suddenly crackled to life with his voice, but this time the words were different. "Turn around, Jake. Look at me. Look at yourself." Jake's eyes were drawn to his rearview mirror against every instinct screaming at him not to look. In the darkness of the following truck's cab, he could now see the driver clearly. It was him. Exactly him. Same face, same expression of growing horror, same reflective sunglasses hanging from the same position on the sun visor. The other Jake raised a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture. Jake screamed and jerked the wheel to the right. His truck lurched onto the shoulder, tires throwing up gravel and dust. He slammed on the brakes and his rig shuddered to a stop. He sat there, engine idling, gasping for breath, waiting for the mirror truck to pass him. But it didn't. It had vanished completely. The highway behind him was empty, no lights, no traffic, nothing. He looked at his GPS. It showed his correct position, mile marker 262, exactly where he should be based on his departure time and average speed. His fuel gauge showed half a tank, normal consumption. His clock read 11:15 p.m., the right amount of elapsed time. Everything was as it should be. Jake sat in his cab for 20 minutes trying to calm his racing heart, trying to convince himself he'd hallucinated or fallen into some kind of micro-sleep dream state. But he knew what he'd experienced. He'd been caught in something, some loop or fold in reality that had trapped him in repetition. And his double, his mirror self, had been there with him, following him through it. He finished the delivery the next morning, but Jake Torrance never drove that stretch of I-80 again. He changed his routes, even though it meant less money and more complicated logistics. When other drivers asked him why, he just said the road wasn't good for his truck. He never told anyone the truth, not even his wife. But sometimes in his mirrors, when the light hits just right, he sees another truck behind him, maintaining that perfect distance, and his hands tighten on the wheel until his knuckles turn white. Story 2. The Backwards Town. Maria Delgado had been driving cross-country routes for 9 years, and she prided herself on knowing the back roads better than most veterans with twice her experience. She preferred the secondary highways to the interstates, the 2-lane roads that wound through small towns and forgotten America. There was something peaceful about those routes, something that made the long hours in the cab feel less isolating. She drove a red 2017 Freightliner Cascadia and hauled mostly dry goods, furniture, and packaged foods for a regional distributor based out of Atlanta. On October 22, 2020, Maria picked up a load of canned goods and paper products in Charlotte, North Carolina. Destined for a distribution center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, she could have taken I-85 to I-75, a straight shot that would have taken about 6 hours. But Maria preferred Highway 74 through the mountains, a route that added an hour but took her through the beautiful autumn scenery of western North Carolina. She'd made this run dozens of times. She left Charlotte at 5 in the morning, hoping to catch the sunrise over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with temperatures in the low 50s. She had a full thermos of coffee, a playlist of 80s rock, and a good audiobook queued up for when she got tired of music. The first 2 hours passed in the comfortable rhythm she loved about driving, the meditation of the road. Around 7:30, she passed through the town of Rutherfordton, a familiar stop where she sometimes grabbed breakfast at a diner she liked. This morning she kept going, wanting to make good time. The highway climbed into the mountains, winding through forests ablaze with red and gold leaves. Maria had driven this route so many times she knew every curve, every scenic overlook, every small town along the way. At approximately 8:45, she crested a hill and saw a town spread out in the valley below. She frowned slightly, confused. She didn't remember a town at this location. There were only a few small communities along this stretch of 74, and she knew them all by name. This one didn't look familiar. But it had been a few months since her last run on this route, she reasoned. Maybe she was misremembering the geography. The town appeared to be fairly substantial, with a main street, several blocks of commercial buildings, and residential areas spreading up the hillsides. A green highway sign announced it as Ashmont, population 3,200. Maria was certain she'd never seen that name before. She would have remembered it. As she descended into the valley and entered the town limits, she noticed the first strange detail. Everything looked slightly off, as if she were seeing the town through a subtle distortion. The building seemed normal at first glance, but when she looked more closely, small inconsistencies caught her attention. The storefronts on Main Street had signs, but the letters looked wrong. They were backwards, mirror images as if she were reading them in reverse. Maria slowed her truck to 30 miles per hour, the posted speed limit. She passed a gas station with a sign that read Lam Asocdnasag, Mobile and Coca-Cola spelled backwards. A grocery store advertised Stakudor P. Otsurf, fresh products in reverse. Every sign, every piece of text she could see was backwards. Her confusion deepened into unease. The streets were not empty, but the people she saw moved in ways that didn't quite make sense. A man walked backwards down the sidewalk, his gait smooth and natural, as if walking in reverse was the normal way to move. A woman backed her car out of a parking space by driving forward, the vehicle moving in the opposite direction it should have been. Children on the playground of a school moved backwards on swings, swinging in reverse but somehow still pumping their legs in a rhythm that worked with the backwards motion. Maria's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Her heart rate increased. This was wrong, deeply wrong, but she couldn't articulate exactly what she was experiencing. The town looked real, solid, three-dimensional. These were real people, real buildings, real vehicles. But everything operated under rules that were inverted from normal reality. She wanted to speed up, to get through this place as quickly as possible, but something made her maintain the speed limit. Some instinct told her that breaking the rules here, whatever rules governed this backwards place, would be dangerous. She kept her truck at exactly 30 miles per hour. And tried not to make eye contact with any of the residents. A police car pulled out from a side street and fell in behind her. Maria's pulse quickened. The cruiser's lights were off, and it maintained a steady distance just following. She checked her speedometer again, 30 miles per hour exactly. She wasn't breaking any traffic laws. The police car continued to tail her, and Maria could see the officer in her side mirror. He was driving in a normal forward position, but his head was turned completely backwards, facing the rear of his vehicle, as if he were looking where he'd been rather than where he was going. The main street seemed longer than it should have been. Maria had the distinct impression that she'd been driving through this town for too long, that she should have reached the other side by now. She glanced at her odometer. It was counting down instead of up, the numbers decreasing with each rotation of her wheels. She'd entered the town at 73,215 miles, and now it showed 73,210. She was losing distance instead of gaining it. A horrible realization dawned on her. She wasn't passing through this town. She was backing into it somehow, even though her truck was moving forward. The physics made no sense, but the evidence was undeniable. She was going backwards through a backwards place. Maria grabbed her phone, thinking she'd call for help, though she had no idea who she'd call or what she'd say. The screen lit up, but everything on it was reversed. The icons were mirror images, and when she tried to swipe, the interface responded in the opposite direction. The time display showed numbers that counted backwards. As she watched, the seconds decreased rather than increased. The police car behind her turned on its lights, but the red and blue strobes seemed to pull light away rather than emit it, creating areas of darkness that pulsed in rhythm. The officer gestured for her to pull over. Maria's mind raced. Should she comply? Should she keep driving? Every option felt wrong. She decided to stop. She carefully pulled her rig to the side of the backward street and put the transmission in park. The police car stopped behind her and the officer got out. He walked forwards to her door, but his reflection in her mirror walked backwards. Maria rolled down her window, her hand shaking. The officer looked up at her. His face was human, normal in every way except for his eyes. They reflected the world in reverse. In his pupils, Maria could see herself, but backwards, mirror-imaged. When he spoke, his voice came out forwards, but Maria had the sensation she was hearing the words in reverse order, the ends of sentences before the beginnings, though somehow it still made sense. "License and registration," he said, or that's what Maria understood. She fumbled for her documents, her hands trembling so badly she could barely control them. She handed them through the window. The officer looked at them, holding them upside down, or perhaps right side up from his perspective. He nodded. "You're not from here," he said. It wasn't a question. "You shouldn't be here. You need to leave before you get stuck." "How?" Maria managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I get out?" The officer pointed ahead down the main street. "Drive forwards to go backwards. You'll understand when you do it. Don't stop again. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't put your truck in reverse. That will trap you here permanently." He handed her documents back and walked to his cruiser in that strange forwards motion that seemed backwards. Maria sat frozen for a moment, trying to process his instructions. Drive forwards to go backwards. It was nonsense, but then again, everything here was nonsense. She put her truck in gear and accelerated, watching her speed carefully. 30 miles per hour. The main street continued ahead of her, but now she noticed something she'd missed before. The buildings were repeating. She passed the same grocery store twice, the same backwards gas station, the same bank with the reversed sign. She was in a loop. Then she remembered the officer's words. Drive forwards to go backwards. Taking a leap of faith, Maria pressed harder on the accelerator, bringing her speed up to 40, then 50. As she did, something strange happened. The buildings began to pass by in the opposite direction. She was driving forward, but the town was moving backwards around her, as if she were in reverse, even though her transmission was in drive. The loop broke. The main street finally ended, and Maria saw the edge of town approaching. The highway sign said Tnomza fo Stimil, limits of Ashmont backwards. She accelerated harder, pushing 60 now, breaking the speed limit but not caring anymore. Her truck burst through some invisible barrier, and suddenly everything snapped back to normal. The road ahead was Highway 74, exactly as it should be. The GPS showed her correct position. The odometer was counting upwards normally. Maria pulled over at the first wide spot she found and sat there, shaking, for nearly an hour. She checked her phone. It was 9:15 a.m., exactly 30 minutes after she'd first seen the town. Only 30 minutes, though it had felt like hours. She never found Ashmont again. She drove that route several more times, always in daylight, always alert for any sign of the backwards town. She asked other drivers if they'd ever heard of it. No one had. She searched for it online, looked at maps, studied census records. No town called Ashmont existed anywhere near that stretch of highway, not now and not in any historical record she could find. But Maria knows what she experienced. She drove through a place where the rules were inverted, where backwards was forwards and nothing made sense. She still drives Highway 74 sometimes, but she's never made that run in the early morning again. She can't shake the feeling that the town is still there, waiting in some fold of reality, catching drivers who pass through at just the wrong time. And she wonders what would have happened if she'd put her truck in reverse, if she'd been trapped there permanently, walking backwards through backward streets for eternity. Story 3. The Loading Dock. Vincent McCarthy was a dedicated overnight driver who specialized in time-critical pharmaceutical deliveries across the Northeast Corridor. At 53 years old, with 28 years of commercial driving experience, he'd earned a reputation for reliability and discretion. The medical supply companies trusted him with expensive shipments, temperature-sensitive medications, and tight deadlines. He drove a white 2018 Kenworth T680 equipped with a refrigerated trailer that he maintained meticulously. On January 9th, 2021, Vincent received an unusual assignment from his dispatcher. A pharmaceutical research facility outside of Princeton, New Jersey needed an emergency pickup. The cargo was described as medical waste that required immediate disposal at a specialized facility in upstate New York. The paperwork seemed standard enough, and the pay was double his normal rate for the urgency. Vincent accepted the job without hesitation. He arrived at the research facility at 11:30 p.m. The address led him down a series of increasingly rural roads, far from the main commercial districts of Princeton. The facility itself was a sprawling complex of low concrete buildings surrounded by high fences and security gates. Bright floodlights illuminated the perimeter, creating harsh shadows and washing out the winter sky above. Vincent checked in at the guard shack, showed his credentials, and was directed to loading Dock 7 on the facility's east side. The security guard, a heavy-set man in his 60s with tired eyes, barely looked at Vincent's paperwork before waving him through. Vincent noticed the guard seemed nervous, glancing repeatedly at something on his monitor screens. The loading dock area was deserted when Vincent backed his trailer up to Dock 7. Usually, even for late-night pickups, there were at least a few workers around, forklift operators or shipping clerks. This place was silent except for the hum of electrical transformers and the distant sound of ventilation systems. The fluorescent lights above the dock flickered occasionally, casting strobing shadows. Vincent set his parking brake and climbed out of the cab. The temperature had dropped significantly, his breath misting in the cold air. He walked to the dock's service door and pressed the intercom button. Static answered him, then a voice, distorted and hollow-sounding. "Back your trailer to the dock and open the rear doors. Load will be brought out momentarily." The voice cut, off before Vincent could respond or ask any questions. He did as instructed, positioning his refrigerated trailer precisely against the rubber bumpers of the loading dock. He opened the rear doors, revealing the empty cargo space, its interior walls lined with refrigeration panels. The temperature inside was set to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, as specified in his delivery instructions. The dock door rolled upward with a metallic screech. Vincent expected to see warehouse workers with pallets or carts. Instead, the interior of the facility was dark, completely black, as if the lights inside had been shut off entirely. He couldn't see more than a few feet into the building. The darkness seemed to absorb the light from the dock area, refusing to yield any details of what lay beyond the threshold. Vincent heard sounds from within that darkness, footsteps, but not quite right. They had an odd rhythm, like someone walking with a limp or something with an unusual gait. Then he heard what sounded like wheels, perhaps a cart or dolly being pushed across concrete. The sounds echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. A figure emerged from the darkness. Vincent's first impression was of a person in some kind of protective suit, the sort of hazmat gear he'd seen in news coverage of disease outbreaks. The figure was completely covered in white material, with a hood and face shield that reflected the dock lights, making it impossible to see the person underneath. The figure pushed a wheeled cart loaded with several large plastic containers, the kind used for medical waste disposal. "Where do you want these?" Vincent asked, trying to keep his voice professional despite the unease crawling up his spine. The figure didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd spoken. It simply pushed the cart into Vincent's trailer and began unloading the containers, stacking them efficiently against the forward wall of the cargo space. More figures emerged from the darkness. 5 of them, all dressed identically in white protective suits, all moving with that same slightly wrong gait. They worked in complete silence, bringing out more containers, more carts. Vincent noticed that the containers were sealed with multiple layers of tape and warning labels. The labels were standard biohazard symbols, but there were others he didn't recognize, symbols that looked almost like arcane markings rather than official safety warnings. The loading process took approximately 30 minutes. Vincent stayed near the front of his trailer, watching but not interfering. The suited figures never spoke to him or to each other. They moved with an efficiency that seemed rehearsed, almost robotic. When the last container was loaded and secured, they all retreated back into the darkness of the facility. The dock door began to lower. "Wait," Vincent called out. "I need a signature on the bill of lading. I need confirmation of the load." The door stopped its descent, leaving a gap of about 3 feet. One of the white-suited figures approached the opening and extended an arm, holding a clipboard. Vincent took it and found the shipping manifest already filled out and signed, though the signature was illegible, just a scrawl of ink that might have been a name or might have been random marks. The figure retreated, and the door slammed shut with a finality that made Vincent flinch. He secured the trailer doors and climbed back into his cab, eager to leave this unsettling place. As he pulled away from the dock, he glanced in his side mirror and saw something that made his blood run cold. The suited figures were standing at the windows of the facility, 6 or 7 of them in different windows, all motionless, all facing his direction. Their face shields reflected the lights of his truck, making it look as if their heads were glowing. Vincent drove toward the security gate, following the access road through the facility's grounds. The guard shack was dark when he approached. The barrier arm was raised, the gate open, but there was no sign of the guard who checked him in. Vincent slowed, considering whether he should stop, but decided against it. He wanted away from this place as quickly as possible. The drive to the disposal facility in upstate New York should have taken about 4 hours. Vincent set his cruise control at 67 miles per hour and tried to settle into his normal driving routine. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cargo in his trailer, those sealed containers, bothered him. He'd hauled medical waste before, and it had never felt like this. An hour into the drive, somewhere on Interstate 287, Vincent heard a sound from his trailer. It was faint, barely audible over the road noise and the rumble of his diesel engine, but distinct. A thumping sound, rhythmic like something hitting the interior walls of the trailer. He turned down his radio and listened more carefully. The thumping continued. 3 beats. Then silence. Then 3 beats again. Vincent told himself it was probably just the containers shifting, the cargo settling. He'd secured everything properly, but sometimes loads moved despite best efforts. He kept driving, but the sound continued, growing gradually louder. The pattern never varied. 3 thumps. Silence. 3 thumps. By the time he reached Newburgh, about 2 hours into the drive, the thumping had become impossible to ignore. It sounded like someone was inside the trailer, striking the walls with their fists. Vincent pulled into a rest area, deciding he needed to check his cargo. If containers had come loose, they could cause damage to his refrigeration equipment. The rest area was nearly empty, just one other semi parked at the far end and a couple of passenger vehicles near the restroom building. Vincent grabbed his flashlight and walked to the rear of his trailer. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily, maintaining the required temperature. He unlocked the rear doors and swung them open. The containers were exactly as they'd been loaded, secured, and stacked against the forward wall. Nothing had shifted. Nothing appeared to be loose. But the temperature inside the trailer was wrong. His gauge showed 38 degrees, but when Vincent stepped inside, it felt much colder, cold enough that his breath came out in thick clouds. Frost had formed on the interior walls, which shouldn't have happened at the set temperature. He approached the containers to check their seals. The warning labels seemed to have changed. The symbols he'd thought looked arcane before now clearly were not standard safety markings. They resembled old alchemical symbols, circles and crosses and geometric patterns that hurt his eyes when he looked at them too directly. and the containers themselves felt wrong to the touch, colder than they should have been and vibrating slightly as if something inside them was moving. Vincent heard the thumping again, but now he was close enough to identify its source. It was coming from inside the containers. All of them a synchronized rhythm. 3 thumps, silence, 3 thumps. Whatever was inside these sealed containers was alive or active or something that his mind couldn't quite categorize. He backed away slowly, his heart racing. This wasn't medical waste. He didn't know what it was, but every instinct screamed at him to get away from it. He jumped down from the trailer, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. His hands shook as he secured the latches. Vincent climbed back into his cab and grabbed his phone. He needed to call his dispatcher, needed to report this, needed someone to tell him what to do. But his phone had no signal. He was in a rest area on a major interstate, and his phone showed 0 bars. He tried several times, walked around the rest area trying to find signal, but nothing worked. He decided to keep driving, to get to the disposal facility and unload this cargo as quickly as possible. Whatever was in those containers, it would be someone else's problem once he delivered it. He just needed to complete the job and get away from this nightmare. The final 2 hours of the drive were torture. The thumping continued, sometimes fading to barely audible, other times growing so loud that Vincent was certain other drivers on the highway must be able to hear it. He pushed his speed to 75, desperate to reach his destination. His refrigeration unit began to make strange sounds, grinding and whining as if the equipment was straining under some impossible load. The disposal facility was located in the Adirondack region, deep in the mountains on a road that barely qualified as paved. Vincent's GPS lost signal 3 times trying to guide him there. He finally found the address at 4:30 in the morning, a concrete bunker built into the side of a mountain surrounded by heavy gates and no trespassing signs. There was no guard shack here, just an automated gate system. Vincent punched in the code he'd been given and the gate swung open. He followed a narrow driveway to a loading bay that looked more like a tunnel entrance than a traditional dock. Floodlights switched on automatically, bathing everything in harsh white light. A door opened in the concrete structure, and a man emerged. He wore normal clothing, jeans and a heavy jacket, and his face was visible. He looked tired but professional. "You're Vincent McCarthy? The Princeton pickup?" "Yes," Vincent managed to say, his voice hoarse from hours of not speaking. "What the hell am I hauling?" The man gave him a sympathetic look. "You don't want to know, and I can't tell you. Classified research, disposal protocols that are above both our pay grades. Did you open the containers?" "No. I checked them once because I heard sounds, but I didn't unseal anything." "Good, that's good." The man pulled out a handheld scanner and approached Vincent's trailer. He spent several minutes checking readings, examining seals, making notes on a digital tablet. Finally, he nodded. "Everything's still contained. We'll unload from here. You can go wait in your cab. This will take about an hour." Vincent didn't argue. He returned to his cab and watched in his mirrors as a team of workers in protective gear, not white like at the research facility, but military-style hazmat suits, systematically unloaded his trailer. They worked with extreme care, using specialized equipment to move the containers. When they were finished, the man in normal clothing approached Vincent's window and handed him a tablet to sign. "One more thing," the man said. "The refrigeration unit in your trailer, it's compromised. The exposure time was too long. You'll need to have it completely replaced, not repaired. Your company will be compensated. There's documentation for the insurance claim in the packet we're giving you." "Compromised how?" Vincent asked. "The materials in those containers emit radiation. Not the kind you're thinking of, not nuclear. Something else. It affects equipment, especially cooling systems and electronics. Your trailer's unit is contaminated. If you keep using it, it'll start to break down in ways that don't make sense. Thermodynamic anomalies. Best to replace it entirely. Vincent accepted the packet of documents, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue or ask more questions. He drove away from that mountain facility as the sun was rising, his empty trailer rattling behind him. The thumping had stopped, but he could still hear it in his memory. That rhythmic pattern that had driven him nearly insane. He had the refrigeration unit replaced 2 days later, as instructed. The technician who removed it called Vincent afterwards, confused and disturbed. The unit's internal components had, somehow, frozen solid despite being powered off and sitting in a heated garage. The metal had fractures that looked like stress damage from extreme cold, even though the unit had never been rated for temperatures below 0. The manufacturer had no explanation. Vincent never accepted another job from that Princeton research facility. When his dispatcher asked why, he said the pay wasn't worth the drive. He never told anyone the full story of what he'd hauled that night, what he'd heard thumping inside those sealed containers, what kind of research could produce waste that violated the normal rules of thermodynamics. He doesn't want to know what was in those containers, what the suited figures at that facility were handling, what disposal protocols required burying things in bunkers under mountains. But sometimes, late at night, when he's driving empty, he hears that sound again in his imagination. 3 thumps, silence, 3 thumps. And he wonders how many other drivers are hauling cargo they don't understand, carrying things between facilities that shouldn't exist, part of a logistics network for projects and research that operates in the shadows. He wonders, and he keeps his questions to himself, and he's very careful about which jobs he accepts now. Story 4. The Passenger. Derek Holland had been driving regional routes in the Pacific Northwest for 12 years, specializing in lumber and construction materials. He knew the logging roads and mountain highways of Oregon and Washington better than most locals. His 2016 International ProStar was outfitted for rugged terrain, with reinforced suspension and auxiliary lighting that turned night into day. He'd driven through every kind of weather these mountains could throw at him, from blinding snowstorms to fog so thick it felt like driving through solid walls. On November 3, 2018, Derek picked up a load of treated lumber from a mill outside of Eugene, Oregon, headed for a construction supply yard in Bellingham, Washington. The route would take him north on I-5, a straight interstate run that he'd made hundreds of times. The weather forecast called for rain, typical for November in the Pacific Northwest, but nothing that concerned him. He left Eugene at 7 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive by early morning. The rain started almost immediately, a steady downpour that drummed against his windshield and made the road reflect his headlights in long streaks of silver. Traffic was light, mostly other commercial vehicles making overnight runs. Around 9:30, somewhere between Salem and Portland, Derek saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway. It was a woman, or appeared to be, wearing what looked like a long coat or dress. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the pouring rain facing the highway. No broken-down vehicle was visible, no emergency flashers, nothing to indicate why someone would be standing on the side of an interstate in the middle of a rainstorm. Derek's first instinct was to call it in to the state police. Someone in that situation needed help. But stopping his loaded semi on a rainy interstate shoulder would be dangerous. He grabbed his CB radio to report the location, but before he could key the microphone, he saw the figure in his passenger side mirror. She was sitting in his passenger seat. Derek's heart stopped. He slammed on his brakes instinctively and his rig shuddered as the anti-lock system engaged. He brought the truck to a controlled stop on the shoulder, his hazard lights flashing. He turned to look at the passenger seat, prepared to confront whoever had impossibly gotten into his locked cab. She sat there, completely dry despite having been standing in the rain moments before. Her clothes were old-fashioned, something from the 1940s or 50s, a dark dress with a high collar. Her hair was styled in an outdated way, pinned up in rolls. Her skin was pale, almost luminous in the dim light of the cab. She looked at Derek with eyes that were too dark, pupils dilated to the point where almost no iris was visible. "I need a ride north," she said. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the rain, but it carried a weight that made Derek's skin prickle. "Please. I've been waiting so long." Derek's mind raced through rational explanations. She'd somehow gotten in when he stopped at the last truck stop. He'd failed to lock the passenger door. He'd been more tired than he realized and hadn't noticed her climbing in. None of these explanations felt right, but they were better than the alternative. His instincts were screaming at him. "How did you get in my truck?" Derek demanded, his voice harder than he intended. His hand moved toward his CB radio, ready to call for help. "The same way I always do," she said, as if this explained everything. "You'll take me north. Everyone takes me north. It's the only way to go." Derek noticed something disturbing about her. She cast no shadow. The light from his dashboard instruments illuminated her face, but didn't cast the shadow it should have on the seat behind her. And she didn't seem to be breathing. Her chest didn't rise and fall. She simply sat there, perfectly still except for her lips when she spoke. "I'm calling the police," Derek said, reaching for his CB. His hand passed through the microphone. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend what had happened. His hand had gone through solid plastic and metal as if they weren't there. He jerked his hand back and stared at it, then at the CB radio. It looked normal, solid, real. "That won't work," the woman said. "Nothing works when I'm here. You just have to drive. Take me north. The road demands it." Derek tried his door handle. His hand closed on it, felt the solid metal, but when he pulled, his hand passed through as if the handle were made of smoke. Panic surged through him. He was trapped in his own cab with this impossible woman, unable to touch anything, unable to leave. "What are you?" he whispered. "A passenger," she said simply. "I died here, on this highway, November 3rd, 1953. I've been trying to go north ever since. Sometimes drivers see me. Sometimes they pick me up. I ride for a while and then I'm back where I started, over and over, 65 years of the same road." Derek's breathing came in short gasps. He was hyperventilating, his vision starting to narrow. He forced himself to take deeper breaths, to think clearly. "If I drive you north, will you leave? Will I be able to get out of my truck?" "Eventually," she said. "When we reach the place where the road turns, you'll know it when you see it. That's where I can get out. That's where everyone lets me out." Derek had no choice. He couldn't leave his cab, couldn't call for help, couldn't do anything except what she was asking. He put his truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The rain continued to pound down, and the road stretched ahead into darkness. The woman sat silently beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Derek tried to focus on driving, on the familiar rhythms of the road, but he couldn't stop glancing at her. She never moved, never shifted position, never blinked. She was like a mannequin, a statue of a person rather than an actual living being. "Tell me about the accident," Derek said after several miles of oppressive silence. He needed her to talk, needed some kind of human interaction even if she wasn't human. "How did you die?" "My husband was driving," she said, her voice distant as if she were reciting something she'd said many times before. "We were going north to see my sister in Seattle. It was raining just like tonight. A logging truck crossed the center line. We hit head-on. He died instantly. I was trapped in the car for hours before anyone found us. I died before they could cut me free. I remember the rain and the pain and the darkness. And then I was standing on the shoulder waiting for someone to take me north. I never made it to my sister's house. I'm still trying to get there." Derek felt a wave of sympathy despite his terror. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Everyone's sorry," she said. But sorry doesn't change anything. The road keeps going. I keep waiting. Drivers keep picking me up, and I never arrive. They drove in silence for another hour. Derek passed through Portland, the city lights blurred by rain and fog. The highway continued north toward Washington. Traffic had thinned to almost nothing. Derek felt completely isolated, as if he and this ghost were the only beings on the entire interstate. Around midnight, somewhere between Portland and Vancouver, the woman spoke again. "This is where it happened. Right here. Mile marker 37. Derek glanced at the mile marker as he passed it. The number was worn and barely visible, but it clearly read 37. He wondered how many times she'd ridden past this spot, how many times she'd pointed it out to drivers who'd picked her up over 65 years. "The logging truck came from there," she said, pointing to an overpass ahead, "crossed right in front of us. My husband tried to brake, but the road was too wet. We slid for what felt like forever. I remember screaming. I remember knowing we were going to die. And then the impact and the pain, and then nothing." Derek saw something ahead that shouldn't be there. A shimmer in the air, like heat waves on summer asphalt, but vertical instead of horizontal. It cut across all lanes of the highway, a curtain of distortion that his headlights couldn't quite penetrate. The woman leaned forward slightly, the first real movement she'd made since appearing in his cab. "That's it," she said. "The turn. When you drive through that, I can get out. That's where the road goes somewhere else." "What do you mean, somewhere else?" Derek asked, but he already knew he didn't want the answer. "The road that the dead travel," she said. "The highway that never ends. Some of us get stuck at places where we died. We can see the living road, but we can't fully leave our spot. But there are places where the roads cross, where the living road and the dead road touch. That's what you're seeing. When you drive through it, you'll cross into both roads at once, for just a moment, long enough for me to get out." Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't want to drive through that shimmer, that crossing point between worlds. Every instinct told him it was dangerous, that passing through it would change something fundamental. But he had no choice. His hands wouldn't leave the wheel. His foot stayed steady on the accelerator. The truck continued forward as if it had a mind of its own. "What will happen to me?" Derek asked. "When I drive through it?" "You'll see," she said simply. "You'll see what I see. Just for a moment. And then you'll be back on your road and I'll be on mine." The shimmer rushed toward them. Derek wanted to close his eyes but couldn't. He had to watch as his truck approached that impossible curtain, as his headlights failed to illuminate what lay beyond it. He pressed forward into the distortion. The world changed. Derek was still driving, still on Interstate 5, but everything was wrong. The highway was full of vehicles, hundreds of them, all moving north in an endless procession. But they were all old, models from decades past, cars and trucks from the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up through the years. And behind the wheel of each vehicle was a pale figure, dark-eyed and still, driving in eternal silence. The road itself glowed with a faint luminescence, as if lit from within. Derek saw the woman's reflection in his windshield. She was smiling, the first expression he'd seen on her face. "Thank you," she said. "Maybe this time I'll make it all the way." She opened the passenger door, which suddenly worked for her even though it hadn't worked for Derek. She stepped out onto the highway, walking toward one of the old cars in the endless procession. A 1948 Buick pulled over and she climbed into the passenger seat. The car pulled back into traffic and continued north, vanishing into the distance. Then Derek's truck passed through the other side of the shimmer and everything snapped back to normal. The highway was empty except for his rig. The rain continued to fall. His passenger seat was vacant. He could move his hands freely again, could touch the CB radio, could grip the door handle. Everything worked as it should. Derek pulled over at the next rest area and sat in his cab for 2 hours, shaking, trying to process what he'd experienced. He'd crossed into whatever place the dead go when they're trapped on roads where they died. He'd seen the highway of ghosts, the endless procession of people driving forever through some twilight version of reality. He eventually continued his delivery to Bellingham, arriving 6 hours later than planned. He called his dispatcher and said he'd had truck trouble, which wasn't exactly a lie. When he drove back south 2 days later, he took Highway 101 along the coast instead of I-5, adding 3 hours to his trip. He hasn't driven that stretch of interstate at night since. Derek knows the woman is still out there, still trying to reach Seattle, still getting picked up by drivers who see her standing in the rain. He wonders if she ever makes it, or if the dead road just loops forever, an eternal journey with no destination. He wonders how many other ghosts are trapped at spots where they died, waiting for someone to take them just a little farther north or south or east or west. He wonders how many times he's driven past them without seeing, how many impossible passengers ride along in trucks all across America. But mostly he remembers the look on her face when she smiled, that moment of hope that maybe this time would be different. And he hopes, despite everything, that she eventually found her way. Story 5. The Inspection Station. Raymond Torres had been hauling freight across the Southwest for 19 years, primarily running routes between California and Texas. He drove a black 2019 Volvo VNL 860 with a sleeper cab configured for long hauls, often spending weeks on the road before returning home to his family in Tucson. He was meticulous about regulations, keeping his logbooks perfect, his vehicle maintained to the highest standards, and his documentation complete. In 19 years, he'd never received a single citation or warning. On June 16, 2021, Raymond picked up a load of electronics from a warehouse in San Diego, headed for a distribution center in San Antonio. The route would take him across Southern California through Arizona and across the vast emptiness of West Texas, a drive he'd made countless times. It was summer, which meant scorching desert temperatures, but his Volvo's air conditioning worked perfectly, and he'd learned long ago to appreciate the stark beauty of the desert landscape. He left San Diego at midnight, planning to drive through the coolest part of the night and early morning before stopping for sleep. The first few hours passed uneventfully. He crossed into Arizona around 3 a.m., the desert dark and silent around him. Interstate 8 stretched ahead like a black ribbon, the white lines measuring out infinity in rhythmic intervals. Around 4:30 in the morning, Raymond saw lights ahead. This wasn't unusual. There were several official way stations and inspection points along this route. As he drew closer, he saw a sign that read, "Commercial Vehicle Inspection Station. All trucks must enter." The station looked official enough, with the standard layout of lanes, scales, and a main building with the typical architecture of a government transportation facility. Raymond had been through this inspection station before, or thought he had. But as he pulled onto the off-ramp and approached the facility, something felt wrong. The lights were too bright, a harsh white that seemed to drain color from everything. And the building itself, while conforming to the general design of inspection stations, had subtle differences. The windows were tinted too dark. The signage was slightly off, the fonts not quite matching standard Department of Transportation style. A uniformed officer stood in the lane, directing Raymond toward the scale. The officer wore what appeared to be a standard DOT uniform, but Raymond noticed the patches on his shoulders didn't show any state designation, just a generic shield symbol. The officer's face was obscured by the brim of his hat and the harsh overhead lights, making his features difficult to discern. Raymond pulled onto the scale and set his parking brake. He gathered his paperwork, license, registration, medical card, and logbook, preparing for the standard inspection routine. He'd done this hundreds of times. It was tedious but never concerning. The officer approached his window. Raymond rolled it down and prepared to hand over his documents, but the officer spoke first. "Engine off. Step out of the vehicle. Bring all documentation with you." The voice was flat, mechanical, without inflection or accent. Raymond complied, noting that it was unusual to be asked to turn off his engine and exit during a simple weight check. The air outside his truck felt wrong. Despite the summer desert heat, it was cold, uncomfortably so, as if he'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. His breath didn't mist, but he felt the chill penetrate his clothing. The officer gestured toward the main building. "Inside, inspection area 3. Raymond followed, his unease growing with each step. The building's exterior was concrete block, painted the standard tan color, but up close he could see that the paint wasn't quite right. It had a texture, as if it were moving slightly, subtly shifting like a living thing. He told himself it was an optical illusion caused by the harsh lighting and his own tiredness. Inside, the building was nearly empty. There was a front desk with no one behind it. A hallway stretched deeper into the structure, lined with doors marked with numbers. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency just on the edge of hearing, irritating and persistent. The officer pointed down the hallway. "Room 3, Inspector will be with you shortly." Raymond walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on linoleum floors that seemed too clean, too sterile. He found room 3 and entered. It was a small office with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and walls covered in regulation posters that looked standard at first glance but revealed themselves to be wrong when examined closely. The posters showed safety regulations and weight limits, but the numbers were off, the graphics distorted, the text written in a style that approximated official government documents but wasn't quite right. Raymond sat in one of the chairs and waited, and waited. His phone showed 4:53 a.m. when he'd entered the room. He checked it again after what felt like 30 minutes, and it still showed 4:53. The time wasn't advancing. He pressed buttons, tried to refresh the screen, but it remained frozen on that time. The door opened and a man entered who wore an inspector's uniform. He carried a clipboard thick with forms. Like the officer outside, his face was difficult to focus on, features that seemed to shift slightly when Raymond tried to look directly at them. The inspector sat behind the desk and began speaking without preamble. "Violation code 777. Vehicle exceeds dimensional parameters. Cargo manifest contains prohibited items. Driver documentation indicates temporal irregularities. Penalties include vehicle impoundment and driver detainment pending further investigation." Raymond's mind reeled. None of what the inspector said made sense. "What are you talking about? My truck is within all legal dimensions. My cargo is electronics, completely legal and properly documented. My logbook is up to date." The inspector continued as if Raymond hadn't spoken, his voice maintaining that same flat, mechanical quality. "Penalty assessment requires full vehicle and cargo inspection. Estimated duration of inspection is 14 hours. You will remain in this facility during the inspection process. Accommodations have been prepared." "This is insane," Raymond said, his voice rising. "I want to speak to your supervisor. I want to call my company. This isn't following any regulation I've ever heard of." The inspector finally looked up from his clipboard, and Raymond got his first clear look at the man's face. It was wrong. The features were human, but they didn't quite align properly. The eyes were too far apart. The mouth didn't move in sync with the words that came out of it. The skin had a waxy quality, like a poorly made mask. "There is no supervisor," the inspector said. "There is no outside communication. This facility exists outside standard jurisdiction. Violations detected at this location are processed under alternative regulatory frameworks. You will comply or face indefinite detainment." Raymond stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm leaving. This isn't legal. You can't hold me without cause. He strode toward the door, but when he reached it, the handle wouldn't turn. He pulled harder, then pushed, but the door was solid, immovable. It wasn't locked. It simply wouldn't open, as if it had become part of the wall. Raymond pounded on the door, shouting for help. The inspector watched him with that mask-like face. Aggressive behavior noted. Additional penalties assessed. Detainment duration extended. Raymond spun around, backing against the door. His heart hammered in his chest. This was a nightmare, it had to be. He'd fallen asleep at the wheel, was dreaming this while his truck drifted off the highway. But the cold metal of the door against his back felt real. The fluorescent lights humming overhead sounded real. The inspector sitting at the desk looked wrong, but he occupied physical space in a physical room. "What do you want?" Raymond asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" "This is an inspection station," the inspector said. "We inspect vehicles that deviate from approved parameters. Your truck entered our jurisdiction at 0432 hours. You triggered threshold sensors. Your vehicle carries something that shouldn't be transported through normal space. The cargo manifest lists electronics, but our scans detect something else, something that exists at frequencies outside standard physics." Raymond thought about his cargo. He'd loaded it himself at the San Diego warehouse, watched as the pallets were placed in his trailer. Electronics, computers, tablets, phones, all properly packaged and documented. There was nothing unusual about any of it. "The cargo is clean," Raymond insisted. "I loaded it myself. It's all commercial electronics." "Your perception of the cargo doesn't match its actual nature," the inspector said. "What you believe you loaded and what your truck actually contains are different things. Probability suggests that substitution occurred during the loading process. You were shown one thing while something else was placed in your trailer. This happens frequently. Most drivers never know what they're really hauling." A horrible thought occurred to Raymond. "If my cargo isn't what I think it is, then why are you inspecting me? Why not just seize the truck and investigate the shipper?" "Because you're the one who's here," the inspector said simply. "You're the one who crossed into our zone. The cargo is secondary. The primary concern is that you perceived the threshold and were drawn to this facility. Most drivers pass through the zone without seeing our station. They remain on their normal highway, oblivious to our presence. But some drivers like you have a sensitivity. You see things that exist at the edge of normal reality. That sensitivity is what we inspect." Raymond felt his legs weaken. He slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his back against the unyielding metal. "I don't understand. What are you? What is this place really?" The inspector stood up and walked around the desk. As he moved, his form seemed to flicker, becoming less solid, more transparent. "We are monitors. We maintain boundaries between what you think of as normal space and the spaces adjacent to it. Sometimes cargo passes through that shouldn't. Sometimes drivers cross over without meaning to. We inspect, we categorize, we process. We exist in the gap between worlds." "How do I get out of here?" Raymond asked. "Complete the inspection process. Submit to the evaluation. If you're determined to be within acceptable parameters, you'll be released. Your perception of time will be adjusted so that you experience no missing hours. You'll return to your truck and continue your route with no memory of this facility." "And if I'm not within acceptable parameters?" The inspector didn't answer. He simply pointed to another door that Raymond hadn't noticed before, a door that had appeared in the wall where there had been solid concrete. "Through there. Evaluation room. The process will begin." Raymond had no choice. He stood up and walked through the doorway into a room that defied geometry. It was too large for the building it was supposed to be inside, a vast space with walls that curved in impossible ways. Equipment lined the walls, machines that looked like combinations of medical devices and something else, something technological but not from any technology Raymond recognized. The evaluation lasted for what felt like days, though Raymond's sense of time had become completely untethered. He was scanned, measured, examined in ways that weren't quite physical, but weren't quite not physical either. Questions were asked in that same flat mechanical voice. Some questions made sense, others were gibberish, strings of words in no language Raymond recognized. He answered when he could, remained silent when he couldn't. Eventually, the process ended. Raymond found himself back in room 3, sitting in the chair, the inspector at the desk. The inspector looked at his clipboard and nodded. Evaluation complete. Status determined to be amber-yellow on the deviation spectrum within acceptable tolerances. Driver may be released with standard memory protocols applied. "I don't want to forget," Raymond said, surprising himself. "Whatever this place is, whatever you are, I want to remember." The inspector paused, the first time it had shown anything resembling uncertainty. "Memory retention is not advised. Knowledge of boundary facilities causes psychological distress in most subjects." "I don't care," Raymond insisted. "I need to know this is real. I need to remember." Another long pause. Then the inspector nodded slowly. "Very well. Memory protocols suspended. Be aware that retention of this experience may affect your perception of normal space. You may begin to see other anomalies, other threshold zones. This can be dangerous." Raymond stood up. The door to the hallway was open now. He walked through it, down the corridor, through the front area that was still empty, and out the main entrance. Outside, the harsh white lights had dimmed to normal levels. The sky showed the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. His truck sat on the scale exactly where he'd left it. He climbed into his cab and checked the clock on his dashboard. 4:53 a.m. No time had passed. Or all time had passed and been wound back. He couldn't tell which. He started his engine, and the officer who directed him to the scale waved him on. Raymond drove back onto the highway, merging with Interstate 8, continuing east. He checked his phone once he was back on the road. It had unfrozen, now showing 5:12 a.m., the correct time based on sunrise and his internal sense of how long he'd been awake. He found the inspection station in his rearview mirror, watching as it receded into the distance. Then it simply wasn't there anymore. The highway behind him was empty. No lights, no building, no exit ramp. The inspection station had ceased to exist, or had returned to whatever liminal space it occupied between worlds. Raymond completed his delivery to San Antonio without incident. But from that night forward, he saw things that other drivers didn't. Shimmers on the highway that indicated threshold zones, buildings that flickered in and out of existence, vehicles that moved in ways that violated physics. The inspector had been right. Once you see the boundaries between normal space and the spaces beyond, you can't unsee them. Raymond still drives, but he's more careful now about which routes he takes, which times of day he travels. He avoids certain highways where the threshold zones cluster more densely. He's learned to recognize the signs that indicate when reality is wearing thin, when the road ahead might lead somewhere other than the destination on his GPS. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, he sees other trucks pulled off at inspection stations that aren't on any map, drivers being evaluated by entities that monitor the boundaries between worlds. He wonders if they'll choose to remember like he did, or if they'll accept the memory protocols and return to normal perception. He wonders if his choice was the right one, carrying this knowledge, seeing these impossible things. But he can't regret it. He knows the truth now. The highways that cross America don't just connect cities and states. They connect realities, dimensions, spaces that exist in the gaps between normal perception. And somewhere out there, in facilities that flicker in and out of existence, monitors maintain those boundaries, inspecting the drivers and cargo that accidentally cross over, processing violations of laws that have nothing to do with weight limits or hours of service. Story 6. The Convoy. Michael Patterson had spent 22 years as an independent owner-operator, running his own freight business with a fleet of 3 trucks that he operated and maintained himself. At 49 years old, he took pride in building his company from scratch, starting with one used Peterbilt and a regional contract, expanding gradually into a respectable operation that kept him comfortable if not wealthy. He drove a 2020 Mack Anthem painted forest green with gold accents, his personal truck that he'd customized exactly to his preferences. On August 7, 2019, Michael accepted a contract to haul construction equipment from a manufacturer in Knoxville, Tennessee, to a development site outside of Boise, Idaho. The load was heavy but legal, massive earth-moving components that would require careful driving through mountain passes. He planned the route meticulously, studying weather forecasts and road conditions, mapping out fuel stops and rest areas. The trip would take 3 days with proper rest breaks. He departed Knoxville at 6 a.m. on a clear summer morning, his truck and trailer properly inspected, his paperwork perfect, his tanks full. The first day passed smoothly. He made it through Tennessee and Kentucky, stopped for the night at a truck stop in St. Louis, got 7 hours of sleep in his sleeper cab, and started the second day refreshed. The second day took him across Missouri and into Kansas, then north into Nebraska. He planned to stop for the night somewhere around North Platte, getting a good rest before tackling Wyoming and Idaho on the third day. Evening found him on Highway 26, a 2-lane road that cut through the Nebraska sandhills, a region of rolling grass-covered dunes that stretched for miles in every direction. Around 8 p.m., as the sun was setting and painting the landscape in shades of orange and gold, Michael saw another truck ahead of him. It was unusual because he hadn't seen much traffic on this rural highway. The truck was an older model, maybe from the 90s, a Freightliner classic with a distinctive long nose and chrome that caught the evening light. Michael closed the distance, not attempting to pass on the winding 2-lane road, just following at a safe distance. A few miles later, another truck joined the highway from a side road, falling in behind Michael. He checked his mirrors and saw it was another older model, a Kenworth W900 with the classic long hood design. Then, as if coordinated, more trucks appeared. One from a dirt access road, another from a ranch entrance, a third from a turnoff Michael hadn't even noticed. Within 10 minutes, Michael found himself in the middle of a convoy of 7 trucks, all older models from the 80s and 90s, all maintained to pristine condition, all moving in perfect synchronization. Michael tried to raise the other drivers on CB radio. "This is Patterson in the green Mack. Anybody in this convoy got your ears on?" Static answered him. He tried channel 19, the standard trucking channel, then cycled through other frequencies. Nothing but static and occasional bursts of what sounded like voices but too distorted to understand. The convoy maintained exactly 60 miles per hour. Michael tried to slow down to let them pass, but when he reduced his speed, the trucks behind him slowed as well, maintaining their position. When he accelerated, trying to leave them behind, the trucks ahead of him accelerated too, keeping him boxed in the middle. The spacing never varied. Each truck was separated by exactly 3 truck lengths, a distance that remained constant no matter what Michael did. The sun set completely and darkness fell over the sandhills. The convoy continued north on Highway 26, moving through the night with headlights cutting through the darkness in a synchronized pattern. Michael noticed that none of the other trucks had running lights or marker lights visible. Just headlights and taillights glowing white and red in the darkness. It was a violation of federal regulations, but then again, nothing about this situation followed normal rules. Michael tried to turn off at an exit for a small town called Hyannis. He put on his turn signal and began to slow, but when he turned the steering wheel, it wouldn't respond. The wheel was locked in position, holding the truck perfectly centered in its lane. Michael pulled harder, using all his strength, but the wheel wouldn't budge. His truck continued north with the convoy, bypassing the exit without deviating. Panic set in. Michael was no longer in control of his own vehicle. Something was driving his truck, keeping him locked in formation with these other semis. He tried the brakes, but they didn't respond. He tried turning off the engine, but the key wouldn't turn in the ignition. Every control in his cab had become useless. He was a passenger in his own truck, trapped in a convoy that moved through the night with inexorable purpose. He looked at the other trucks more carefully, trying to see the drivers. The cabs were dark, no interior lights, but occasionally the headlights of oncoming traffic illuminated them for a moment. In those brief flashes of illumination, Michael saw that the driver's seats appeared to be empty. No silhouettes, no heads visible above the steering wheels. The trucks were driving themselves or being driven by something invisible. The convoy continued for hours. Michael watched his GPS, trying to track their position, but the screen showed something impossible. According to the GPS, they were still on Highway 26, but the road wasn't going where it should. The map showed them traveling north into an area where no roads existed, across sandhills terrain where nothing but ranch land and grassland stretched for miles. Yet the highway beneath his wheels felt solid, real. 2 lanes of asphalt with painted lines and reflective markers. Around midnight, the landscape began to change. The grass-covered dunes gave way to something else, terrain that didn't match anything Michael knew about Nebraska geography. Strange formations of rock appeared, twisted spires that looked like melted stone. The grass turned silver in his headlights, reflecting light in an unnatural way. The sky overhead showed stars, but they were wrong. Constellations Michael didn't recognize, patterns that made his eyes hurt when he tried to follow them. The convoy reached a structure that emerged from the darkness ahead. It was enormous. A building or facility that sprawled across the landscape for what looked like miles. Massive concrete walls rose from the earth, lit by industrial lights that created harsh shadows. Loading docks lined the structure, dozens of them, and each dock had a truck backed up to it. Hundreds of trucks, all old models, all perfectly maintained, all sitting silent and dark. Michael's convoy approached one section of the facility and the trucks began to separate, each heading for a specific dock. Michael's truck steered itself toward Dock 47, backing up with precision that would have been impressive if it weren't terrifying. His trailer connected with the dock, and he felt the thump of impact through his suspension. Then his engine shut off and all his controls went dead. Even his headlights extinguished, leaving him in complete darkness. Michael sat in that darkness for a long moment, his breathing loud in the silence of his cab. Then lights came on inside the facility, visible through his windshield. He could see into a warehouse area that stretched farther than his eyes could track. The space was filled with cargo, pallets and crates and containers stacked in organized rows that seemed to go on forever. Figures moved in the warehouse. They were human-shaped but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, or with proportions that didn't quite match normal anatomy. They wore what looked like workers' coveralls, but the fabric had a sheen to it, as if it were made from something metallic or crystalline. The figures moved with efficiency, loading and unloading trucks, operating forklifts, organizing cargo. Michael's trailer began to shake. He could feel movement through the frame of his truck, the sensation of something being unloaded. But he'd been hauling construction equipment, massive components that would require a crane or heavy forklift. Whatever was taking his cargo was doing it quickly, efficiently, in a matter of minutes. Then the unloading stopped, and Michael felt new weight being added to his trailer. His suspension compressed and the truck settled lower on its springs. Whatever was being loaded was heavy, heavier than the construction equipment had been. The loading process took perhaps 10 minutes, fast work for cargo that size. A figure appeared at Michael's driver's side door. It looked up at him through the window, and Michael got his first clear look at one of these beings. It was humanoid with a face that approximated human features, but the eyes were entirely black. No whites, no irises, just pools of darkness. Its skin was pale gray, smooth like plastic. When it opened its mouth to speak, Michael could see that it had no tongue, just a dark cavity. "Delivery route reassignment," the being said, its voice emanating from its mouth but sounding wrong, as if produced electronically rather than by vocal cords. "Original cargo has been confiscated. Replacement cargo has been loaded. You will deliver to the following coordinates. Destination information has been programmed into your navigation system. Do not deviate from the route. Do not inspect the cargo. Do not discuss this transaction with external parties." "What the hell is this?" Michael managed to say, his voice shaking. "What did you take from my trailer? What did you put in?" "Questions are not part of the protocol," the being said. "You will complete the delivery. Upon arrival at the destination, the cargo will be automatically unloaded. Your payment has been adjusted to reflect the route modification. Your memory of this facility will be suppressed, but you will retain instruction compliance. Drive safely." The being walked away, disappearing into the warehouse. Michael's truck started by itself, the engine turning over without him touching the key. His headlights came on. His dashboard lit up and his GPS screen showed new destination coordinates, a location in Idaho that was several hundred miles off his original route. The steering wheel remained locked, but now his truck was in motion, pulling away from the dock, following the convoy back out of the facility. The return journey through that impossible landscape felt like a dream. Michael sat in his cab, hands hovering uselessly over a steering wheel he couldn't control, watching as the twisted rock formations and silver grass gradually transformed back into normal Nebraska sandhills. The convoy dispersed as they reached Highway 26, each truck peeling off at different exits or side roads until Michael was alone, again driving north in the pre-dawn darkness. As the sun rose, Michael felt something shift in his mind. His memory of the facility began to fade, becoming dreamlike, losing detail and clarity. He knew something had happened during the night, something important and disturbing. But he couldn't quite recall the specifics. He remembered being in a convoy, remembered losing control of his truck. But the middle section, the facility and the beings in the cargo exchange, became foggy and indistinct. But the GPS still showed the new destination coordinates, and when Michael finally regained control of his truck, when the steering wheel unlocked and he could access his controls again, he found himself following those coordinates anyway. Some part of him, some instruction that had been planted deeper than conscious memory, compelled him to complete the delivery. He arrived at the new destination on August 9th, a warehouse facility outside of Twin Falls, Idaho, nowhere near Boise, where he was supposed to deliver the construction equipment. The warehouse was unmarked, just a concrete building at the end of a dirt road. As soon as Michael backed his trailer to the loading dock, he felt that same sensation of rapid unloading, his cargo being removed by forces or equipment he couldn't see or understand. When the unloading finished, Michael pulled forward and opened his trailer to check what had been taken. The trailer was empty, completely empty, but something was wrong with the interior. The walls were scorched, dark burn marks that radiated from where the cargo had been stacked. And in the center of the trailer floor was a symbol, burned into the metal, a geometric pattern that hurt to look at, lines and angles that seemed to fold into dimensions his eyes couldn't track. Michael closed the trailer and drove away, his hands trembling on the wheel. Over the next few days, fragments of memory returned. He remembered the convoy with increasing clarity, remembered the facility and the beings, remembered the exchange of cargo. He never told anyone about it. Who would believe him? He couldn't even prove it had happened. The construction equipment he was supposed to deliver never arrived at the Boise site. His company took a financial hit, his reputation suffered, and he lost the contractor who'd hired him for that job. But Michael received a payment, a wire transfer to his business account from an unknown source, triple what he would have made on the original delivery. And with the money came a new set of route instructions, another delivery, another convoy assignment. Michael hasn't driven a normal freight route since. Once or twice a month he receives coordinates, picks up cargo from unmarked facilities, joins convoys of autonomous trucks that drive through the night to destinations that don't appear on any map. He hauls things that he's been instructed not to inspect, delivers them to places that exist at the edges of normal geography. The pay is good, the best he's ever made. But Michael knows he's no longer working for human clients. He's become part of a logistics network that operates in parallel to normal commerce, moving cargo between realities, servicing facilities that exist in the gaps between normal space. He's one of dozens, maybe hundreds of drivers who've been recruited or conscripted into this shadow fleet. And every time he joins a convoy, drives through the night with those older trucks in perfect formation, he wonders if he'll ever be released, if he'll ever return to normal hauling, or if he's bound to this route forever. His truck locked in formation, following invisible drivers to impossible destinations. Story 7. The Detour. Nathan Wu had been driving for 15 years, specializing in refrigerated transport of produce and perishable goods across the western states. He took pride in his ability to maintain temperature-controlled shipments, ensuring that delicate cargo arrived in perfect condition regardless of external weather or road conditions. His 2021 Freightliner Cascadia was equipped with a state-of-the-art refrigeration unit, backup systems, and monitoring technology that alerted him to any temperature fluctuations immediately. On April 23, 2020, Nathan loaded a shipment of organic produce from farms in California's Central Valley, headed for specialty grocery stores in Seattle, Washington. The cargo included strawberries, leafy greens, and other high-value items that required precise temperature control at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. He departed Fresno at 9 p.m., planning to drive through the night up Interstate 5, the most direct route to Seattle. The first few hours passed normally. Nathan made his usual fuel stop at Stockton, checked his refrigeration unit's readings, and confirmed that everything was functioning perfectly. He continued north through the Sacramento Valley, watching the flat agricultural land gradually transform into the rolling foothills of Northern California. Around 1 a.m., somewhere between Redding and the Oregon border, Nathan saw the highway signs for a detour. Electronic message boards flashed warnings about road construction ahead, directing all northbound traffic to take the next exit and follow the marked detour route. Nathan sighed. Detours meant delays, and with perishable cargo, every hour mattered. But he had no choice. He took the exit and followed the signs onto a 2-lane highway that led east into the mountains. The detour signs were professional, standard Caltrans orange with reflective lettering, exactly what would be used for legitimate road construction. Nathan saw other vehicles taking the same route, a few passenger cars and one other semi. The presence of other traffic reassured him. This was a real detour, properly marked and managed. The highway climbed into the Cascade Range, winding through dense forest. Nathan noticed that the other vehicles gradually disappeared. The cars turned off at various points, taking what appeared to be local roads. The other semi pulled into a rest area and stopped. Within 20 minutes, Nathan was alone on the detour, his headlights cutting through darkness and mist. The road became rougher, the pavement cracked and potholed. Nathan slowed to protect his cargo from excessive jarring. He checked his GPS, trying to see how long this detour would last, but the screen showed something confusing. According to the GPS, he was no longer on any mapped road. The display showed his position as a blue dot in the middle of unmarked territory. No highway lines, no road names, just blank space. Nathan tried his cell phone, thinking he'd call his dispatcher to report the situation. No signal. That wasn't particularly unusual in the mountains, but combined with the GPS issue, it increased his unease. He kept driving, following the detour signs that appeared at regular intervals. Orange markers with arrows pointing him deeper into the mountains. Around 3 a.m., the road crossed a ridge and descended into a valley that Nathan had never seen before. And he'd driven this region for 15 years. The valley was narrow, hemmed in by steep mountain walls on both sides. At its center was a small town, lights visible in the darkness, buildings arranged along a main street. A detour sign directed him through the town, and Nathan followed, hoping to find someone who could tell him how to get back to Interstate 5. The town was called Ashwood, according to a welcome sign at the city limits. Population 974. Nathan didn't recognize the name. He would have remembered a town in this location. It would have been a useful fuel stop or rest point on his regular routes, but he'd never heard of Ashwood. As he drove down the main street, Nathan noticed that the town looked frozen in time. The architecture was older, buildings from the 50s and 60s, storefronts with vintage signage and styling. A few vehicles were parked along the street, all of them older models, nothing more recent than the early 70s. But the lights were on in several buildings, suggesting the town wasn't abandoned. Nathan saw a gas station that was still open, an old-style service station with pumps that looked ancient but functional. He pulled in, thinking he'd ask for directions and maybe top off his diesel tanks. A man emerged from the station office wearing mechanic's coveralls and wiping his hands on a rag. He was perhaps 60 years old, with weathered features and gray hair. "Help you?" the man asked as Nathan climbed out of his cab. "I'm on a detour," Nathan explained. "I need to get back to Interstate 5 northbound. Can you tell me how to get there from here?" The man's expression became guarded. "Detour? There's no construction on the interstate, hasn't been for months." "There were signs," Nathan insisted. "Electronic message boards warning about construction, directing traffic to exit. I followed the detour markers here." The man studied Nathan for a long moment, then looked at Nathan's truck, taking in the modern freight liner, the refrigerated trailer, the professional markings. "What year is it?" the man asked quietly. Nathan frowned, confused. "What?" "It's 2020, April 23rd. The man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "It's 1973 here, June 8th, always June 8th, always 1973. Has been for as long as any of us can remember." Nathan felt the ground seem to tilt beneath him. "That's impossible. This is some kind of joke." "No joke," the man said. "You followed a detour that doesn't exist, took an exit that isn't really there. You drove into Ashwood. People do occasionally. Drivers mostly, though sometimes passenger vehicles. You take a detour in the mountains, and if you're unlucky, if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, you end up here, in a town that stopped existing in 1973 but never quite managed to disappear." Nathan backed away from the man, his heart racing. This was insane. He'd driven into some community of people who were delusional, who thought they were living in the past. He needed to leave, to get back to the real world. He climbed into his cab and started his engine. "You can try to leave," the man called after him, "but the road loops back. It always loops back to Ashwood. The only way out is to wait for the next detour, for the road to open back up to real time. Could be hours, could be days. Nobody knows what triggers it." Nathan ignored him, pulling out of the gas station and continuing through the town. The detour signs led him to the far end of Ashwood, where the highway continued into the darkness beyond. He accelerated, pushing his speed up to 60 miles per hour despite the winding mountain road. He was getting out of this place, getting back to Interstate 5, getting back to reality. But after 30 minutes of driving, he saw lights ahead. A town appeared, arranged in a narrow valley between steep mountain walls. The same town, Ashwood. He'd somehow looped back to where he'd started. Nathan pulled over and sat in his cab, breathing hard, trying to process what was happening. He tried the route again, driving faster, watching for any turnoffs or side roads, but the highway offered no alternatives. It led through Ashwood, continued into the mountains, and then curved back to Ashwood again. The loop was inescapable. Nathan was trapped, driving in a circle through a town that existed in 1973, cut off from the real timeline. He returned to the gas station and found the mechanic still there, sitting on a bench outside the office, as if he'd been waiting. Nathan got out and approached him, defeated. "How long have you been here?" "I don't remember," the man said. "Time gets fuzzy when you're stuck in a loop. I think I took a detour in 74, stopped here for gas and couldn't leave. But I've lived years since then. Subjectively, I've aged. The town stays the same, but we age. There are maybe 30 people here now, all of us detoured, all of us trapped." "Why June 8th, 1973? Nathan asked. "What's significant about that date?" "Something happened here that day," the mechanic said. "An accident, we think. A fuel truck crashed on the road just outside of town. Massive explosion. Fire burned for 3 days. When it finally went out, Ashwood had slipped, fallen out of the normal flow of time. We're stuck at the moment just before the crash, repeating it over and over." Nathan walked back to his truck and checked his refrigeration unit. The temperature reading showed 42 degrees, already 6 degrees warmer than it should be. His cargo was starting to spoil. He had maybe 12 hours before the produce would be completely ruined. He needed to get out of this loop before then, or his entire shipment would be lost. He spent the next several hours driving the loop, searching desperately for any deviation, any exit, any way back to the real timeline. But the road was implacable. It led through Ashwood, into the mountains, and back to Ashwood. Always the same route, always the same distance, always ending where it began. As dawn approached, or what passed for dawn in this frozen moment of time, Nathan returned to the town and parked near what appeared to be a diner. He went inside and found half a dozen people, all of varying ages, all wearing clothing from decades past. They looked at him with sympathy and resignation. An elderly woman behind the counter poured him coffee without asking. "You're wasting fuel driving the loop," she said. "Everyone does it at first. But there's no way out except to wait. The detour will open again eventually. It always does. And when it opens, you'll know. The road will feel different. You'll be able to break the loop." "How long?" Nathan asked desperately. "How long until it opens?" "No way to tell," the woman said. "Sometimes it's quick, a few hours, sometimes it takes days. We've learned to be patient. There's nothing else we can do." Nathan sat in the diner, drinking coffee, watching the other trapped residents of Ashwood go about their routines. They had adapted to this existence, living in a perpetual June 8th, 1973, knowing that the world outside was moving forward without them. Some of them had been here for what they subjectively experienced as years. They'd built lives in this frozen moment, finding purpose in repetition. Around noon, Nathan felt something change. It was subtle, a shift in the air pressure, a difference in the quality of light. He stood up abruptly, spilling his coffee. "The road," he said. "Something's different." The elderly woman smiled. "Go now. Drive the loop. If it's opening, you'll break through this time." Nathan ran to his truck and started it, his hands shaking with hope and fear. He drove through Ashwood one more time, following the familiar route into the mountains, and this time when the road curved back toward where the town should be, it didn't. It continued straight, climbing up a ridge, cresting it, and descending into terrain that Nathan recognized. He was back in the normal Cascade Range, on a two-lane highway that his GPS identified as Highway 97. He drove for 2 hours, finally reconnecting with Interstate 5 near the Oregon border. His refrigeration unit showed 48 degrees now. Too warm, his cargo partially spoiled. He'd lost time, more than what his clock showed. According to his dashboard, he'd been driving for 6 hours since leaving Fresno. But his body felt the exhaustion of having been awake and stressed for more than 12 hours. Nathan completed his delivery to Seattle, but half his cargo was rejected due to temperature inconsistencies and spoilage. His company took a financial hit, and Nathan had to file a detailed report explaining what had happened. He told them there was a detour, that he'd gotten lost on back roads, that his refrigeration unit had malfunctioned. He didn't mention Ashwood or the time loop or the people trapped in 1973. He never saw detour signs on that stretch of Interstate 5 again, though he drove it dozens of times afterward. He searched for Ashwood on maps, in historical records and county archives. He found mention of a small mining town called Ashwood that had existed in the Cascades in the 1960s and early 70s. But it had been abandoned after a fuel truck accident in June of 1973. The town was officially delisted, its residents relocated, the buildings left to decay. But Nathan knows what he experienced. He drove through a living Ashwood, a town that refused to accept its own ending, that trapped itself in a loop at the moment before disaster struck. He wonders about the people he met there, the mechanic and the woman in the diner and the others. They're still there, still trapped in June 8, 1973, still waiting for detours to open so they can try to escape, even though most of them have stopped trying. They've accepted their existence in the loop, finding whatever peace they can in eternal repetition. And Nathan wonders if he could find the detour again if he tried, if he could deliberately navigate back to that town outside of time. He thinks about the mechanic's words, about how people age while the town stays the same. He wonders what happens when those trapped residents finally die, if they do. Do they disappear? Do they loop back to their arrival date? Or do they remain as ghosts in a town that's already a ghost? Nathan doesn't take detours anymore. When he sees construction warnings or route diversions, he stops and waits, sometimes for hours, until the main road reopens. Other drivers complain. His company questions his efficiency, but Nathan doesn't care. He won't risk ending up in another loop, another town frozen in time. One glimpse of what exists in the gaps between normal reality was enough for a lifetime. Story 8. The radio station. Gloria Hartman had been driving for 8 years, one of the relatively few women in long-haul trucking, and she'd faced down every challenge and stereotype with quiet competence and unshakable professionalism. She drove a burgundy 2017 Peterbilt 389 with a custom interior that she'd modified herself, comfortable and efficient for the long stretches on the road. Her routes primarily covered the South, running loads between Florida, Texas, and the Gulf states. On September 14, 2021, Gloria picked up a load of furniture from a manufacturer in High Point, North Carolina, headed for a distribution warehouse in Mobile, Alabama. It was a straightforward run, about 800 miles, which she planned to cover over 2 days with an overnight stop. She departed High Point at 4 p.m., timing it to drive through the evening and night when traffic was lighter and temperatures cooler. The first several hours were uneventful. Gloria listened to an audiobook, watched the North Carolina landscape transition to South Carolina, stopped for fuel and a meal near Columbia. She was in good spirits, looking forward to completing this delivery and heading home for a few days off. By 11 p.m., she was crossing into Georgia, the highway mostly empty except for occasional clusters of traffic around the larger cities. Around midnight, somewhere between Macon and Columbus on Highway 80, Gloria was scanning through radio stations looking for music to help her stay alert. Most stations had signed off for the night or were playing automated programming, nothing that held her interest. Then she found a station that caught her attention. No call letters, no station identification, just a man's voice speaking in calm, measured tones. "Truckers on Highway 80 between Macon and Columbus," the voice said. "We have reports of severe weather approaching from the west. Heavy rain, possible flash flooding. Drivers are advised to seek shelter or alternative routes. This is not an official weather service announcement. This is a warning from those who monitor the roads." Gloria glanced at her weather app on her phone. It showed clear conditions, no storms in the area, no warnings or advisories. She looked out her windshield at a sky full of stars, not a cloud visible. The radio voice had to be wrong, or perhaps she was picking up a signal from some distant station where weather was actually severe. She continued driving, but kept the station tuned in, curious. After a moment of silence, the voice returned. "Driver of the burgundy Peterbilt northbound at mile marker 112. Gloria Hartman of Valdosta, Georgia. You need to take the next exit. The road ahead is compromised. This is not a suggestion." Gloria's blood ran cold. The voice had used her name, described her truck, knew her exact location. She grabbed her CB radio and keyed the microphone. "This is Gloria Hartman. Who's on this frequency? How do you know my name?" The response came through her FM radio, not the CB. "We monitor the roads. We watch the drivers. We see things that your instruments can't detect. The road ahead of you is going to collapse at mile marker 115 in approximately 8 minutes. You need to exit now, or you'll be caught in the structural failure." "This is insane," Gloria said aloud, though no one could hear her. "Roads don't just collapse. And how the hell are you broadcasting my name over the radio?" But even as she spoke, a part of her was frightened. The voice knew too much, specific details it shouldn't have access to. And something in its tone, that calm certainty, made her instincts scream that this was real, that she was in danger she couldn't see. An exit sign appeared in her headlights. County Road 43, a rural route that led into farmland. Gloria made a split-second decision and took the exit, pulling off the highway and onto the access road. She stopped on the shoulder and sat there, engine idling, watching her clock. 8 minutes, the voice had said. 8 minutes until mile marker 115 would collapse. She counted down, watching the digital clock on her dashboard tick through the minutes. 7 minutes, 6, 5. At 3 minutes, she started to feel foolish. She'd taken an unnecessary detour based on a bizarre radio broadcast that was probably some kind of hoax or prank. She was about to pull back onto the highway when she heard a sound in the distance. A rumble, then a tremendous crash like an explosion. Gloria grabbed her phone and called 911. "I'm on Highway 80 near mile marker 112. I just heard what sounded like a crash or explosion ahead. You need to send emergency services." The dispatcher took her information and told her to stay where she was. Gloria waited, watching emergency vehicles race past on the highway, lights flashing in the darkness. After about 30 minutes, a state trooper pulled up to where she'd parked and approached her window. "Ma'am, did you call in the report of the incident?" the trooper asked. "Yes, officer, I heard it from here. What happened?" "Bridge collapse at mile marker 115, the trooper said, his face grim. "No warning, structural failure. 2 vehicles went into the gap before we could get it blocked off. We're still working on rescue operations. You're lucky you took this exit. If you'd been on the highway, you'd have been right at that location when it went down." Gloria felt her hands begin to shake. A bridge collapsed? Just suddenly, no warning? Engineers are saying it's unprecedented, the trooper said. The bridge passed inspection 3 months ago. No indication of structural problems. It just failed. They're investigating whether there was some kind of subsurface erosion or seismic activity. After the trooper left, Gloria sat in her truck for a long time, trying to process what had happened. The voice on the radio had warned her, had known her name and location, had given her an exact time until disaster. It had saved her life. But what was it? How had it known? She turned her radio back to the frequency where she'd heard the voice. Static greeted her. She adjusted the tuning, searching for any signal. After several minutes, the voice returned. Gloria Hartman, you survived. Good. You listened. Many don't. They think we're a prank or a hallucination. They die on roads that fail, in accidents that seem random but aren't. We monitor, we warn, we try to protect the drivers. Who are you? Gloria asked, speaking to her radio, even though she knew it couldn't transmit on FM frequencies. What are you? We are the ones who watch, the voice said. Drivers who died on these roads, accidents, breakdowns, violence, illness. We couldn't leave. We're tied to the highways, bound to the routes where we spent our lives. We see things now, patterns in the road, weaknesses in the infrastructure, dangers that are invisible to the living. We broadcast warnings when we can to those who are sensitive enough to hear us. Gloria felt tears on her face, though she wasn't sure if they were from fear or gratitude or something else entirely. You're ghosts? Dead truckers watching the roads? We're what remains, the voice said. Echoes of drivers imprinted on the highways. We can't rest, we can't move on, so we warn, we protect. We try to save others from the fates we suffered. How many of you are there? Gloria asked. Hundreds, the voice said. Thousands, maybe. Every highway in America has watchers. Drivers who died and couldn't leave. We form a network, passing information, monitoring conditions. Some of us have been here for decades. We've watched trucks evolve from simple rigs to the sophisticated machines you drive now. We've watched the roads expand and deteriorate and change. But we remain constant, vigilant. Why can I hear you? Gloria asked. Why me? You're sensitive, the voice said. Some drivers are. They can perceive us, receive our broadcasts. We gravitate toward them, try to protect them especially. You'll hear us again, Gloria, on this highway and others. We'll warn you when danger approaches. Listen to us, trust us. We're trying to keep you alive. The signal faded into static, then silence. Gloria sat in her truck until dawn, too, shaken to continue driving. She eventually called her dispatcher and explained that she'd been delayed by the bridge collapse, that she'd witnessed the emergency response and been held at the scene. It wasn't exactly a lie, just an incomplete version of the truth. She completed her delivery to Mobile a day late, but her company was understanding given the circumstances. The bridge collapse made regional news, a tragedy that killed 3 people and injured 7 others. Engineers determined that subsurface water erosion had weakened the bridge supports over months or years, leading to sudden catastrophic failure. It was being called a freak accident, unpredictable and unpreventable. But Gloria knew it had been predicted. The watchers had known, had seen the weakness in the structure, had warned her in time to avoid it. And they were right about her hearing them again. Over the weeks and months that followed, Gloria picked up their broadcasts regularly. Sometimes it was specific warnings, alerting her to hazards ahead, accidents forming, dangerous drivers in her vicinity. Other times it was just voices, conversations between the watchers, discussing conditions on various highways, sharing information about trouble spots. She learned to recognize individual voices. There was Thomas, who died in a jackknife accident on I-10 in 1998. He monitored the Gulf Coast routes, warning drivers about sudden weather changes and rough road surfaces. There was Linda, killed by a drunk driver on I-75 in 2005. She watched over the Florida runs, particularly protective of female drivers, alert to any signs of violence or harassment. There was James, who'd had a heart attack at the wheel on I-20 in 2012. He focused on driver health, warning people when he sensed they were too tired or unwell to continue safely. Gloria started thinking of them as guardian angels, these dead drivers who watched over the living. She was grateful for their protection, even though the knowledge of their existence was heavy to carry. She couldn't tell anyone about them without sounding insane. When other drivers asked how she seemed to avoid accidents and hazards with uncanny precision, she just said she had good instincts. But the watchers gave her more than warnings. They gave her companionship. The long hours on the road were less lonely knowing that she was never truly alone, that eyes that couldn't die were looking out for her. She started talking to them, updating them on her life, sharing her thoughts and worries. Sometimes they responded, their voices crackling through her radio with advice or encouragement or just acknowledgement that they'd heard her. One night, about 6 months after the bridge incident, Gloria was driving through southern Georgia on a route she'd driven hundreds of times. The radio came alive with urgent voices, multiple watchers all speaking at once. "Gloria, stop! Stop! Now! Pull over immediately!" She didn't question it. She hit her brakes and guided her rig onto the shoulder, coming to a complete stop. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Your trailer," Thomas's voice said. "Kingpin failure imminent. The mechanism has been gradually weakening. In approximately 1 mile at highway speed, it will separate. Your trailer will detach from your truck. At 65 miles per hour, the result will be catastrophic." Gloria got out and inspected her fifth-wheel coupling, grabbing a flashlight from her cab. She could see the problem immediately once she knew to look for it. Stress fractures in the kingpin, nearly invisible but definitely there. If she'd continued driving, the kingpin would have failed. Her trailer would have broken free and she'd have lost control at highway speed. It would likely have killed her and possibly other drivers. She called for roadside assistance and had her truck towed to a repair facility. The mechanic who examined the kingpin was stunned. "This is incredible," he said. "This was about to fail completely. How did you know to stop? There wouldn't have been any warning, no sound or vibration, just sudden catastrophic failure." "Just lucky," Gloria said. "I had a feeling something was wrong." That night, parked in the repair facility's lot, Gloria tuned her radio to the frequency where the watchers broadcast. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved me again." "We protect our own," Linda's voice responded. "You're one of us now, in a sense. You hear us, you trust us, you're part of the network. We'll watch over you as long as you drive these roads." "What happens when I retire?" Gloria asked. "When I eventually stop driving?" "Then you'll fade from our awareness," James said. "We're tied to active drivers, to trucks in motion, to the highway's pulse. When you leave the road, you'll stop hearing us. You'll be released from the network, but until then, you're never alone out here." Gloria Hartman still drives the southern routes, still listens to the radio frequency where the dead drivers broadcast their warnings and wisdom. She's avoided 4 major accidents, 3 vehicle failures, and 2 dangerous situations with human predators, all because the watchers warned her in time. Other drivers talk about Gloria's amazing luck, her seemingly supernatural ability to avoid trouble. Some call her the safest driver on the Gulf Coast runs. But Gloria knows it's not luck. It's protection from drivers who couldn't save themselves but dedicated their afterlife to saving others. She knows that every highway in America has its watchers, ghosts of truckers maintaining eternal vigilance, trying to prevent other drivers from joining their ranks. Most drivers never hear them, never know they're there. But some, the sensitive ones, can tune into that frequency where the dead speak to the living, where warnings are broadcast from beyond the grave. And Gloria listens. She always listens. Because on the highway, the difference between life and death can be a single warning, one voice crackling through static, one ghost who cares enough to watch over the living. She drives with confidence, knowing that eyes that never blink are watching her mirrors, that voices that never tire are calling out dangers, that the network of watchers will keep her safe as long as she trusts them. Sometimes, late at night on empty highways, Gloria wonders what will happen when her time comes, when she eventually dies, whether on the road or years later in retirement. Will she join the watchers if she dies while still driving? Will she become one of those voices on the radio warning other sensitive drivers about dangers they can't see? She doesn't know, and the watchers won't tell her. But if it happens, if she becomes bound to the highways like they are, she thinks it wouldn't be the worst fate. To spend eternity protecting other drivers, keeping them safe, watching over the roads she loved in life. There are worse ways to exist beyond death. Story 9. The Repeating Load. Carl Henderson was a veteran driver with 31 years of experience, known throughout the industry for his reliability and his willingness to take difficult or unusual loads that other drivers refused. He drove a white 2014 Kenworth T660, older but impeccably maintained, with over 1 million miles on the odometer. At 57 years old, Carl had seen every kind of cargo, every type of road condition, every variety of challenge that trucking could present. On December 2, 2019, Carl accepted a rush delivery from his dispatcher. The load was medical supplies and equipment being transported from a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey to a hospital in upstate New York. The urgency was emphasized repeatedly. Lives potentially depended on this delivery arriving within 12 hours. Carl accepted without hesitation. Rush medical deliveries were his specialty. He arrived at the pharmaceutical company's distribution center at 6 p.m. and watched as his trailer was loaded with pallets of boxes, everything properly secured and documented. The manifest listed various medical supplies, IV medications, diagnostic equipment, standard hospital materials. The load weight was within legal limits. The paperwork was complete, and Carl was on the road by 7:15. The route was straightforward, Interstate 80 across New Jersey, then north on various state highways into the Catskill region where the hospital was located. Carl estimated 6 hours of drive time, accounting for weather conditions. Light snow was forecast, and the winding mountain roads in the final segment. He planned to arrive around 1 or 2 in the morning. The first hour passed normally. Carl made good time crossing New Jersey, his truck handling well despite the beginning of light snowfall. He stopped briefly at a rest area to use the facilities and grab coffee, then continued onto the state highways that would take him north into the mountains. Around 10 p.m., Carl arrived at the hospital. He was surprised to find that he'd made better time than expected, covering the distance in less than 3 hours despite the snow. The hospital's loading dock was well lit and clearly marked. He backed his trailer into position and went to find someone to sign for the delivery. A nurse met him at the dock entrance. "You're here with the medical supplies? Thank goodness, we need these urgently." She directed orderlies to begin unloading, and Carl handed over the manifest for signature. The unloading took about 40 minutes, and then Carl was released to continue to his next pickup. He checked his phone for the details of his next load. His dispatcher had sent him coordinates for a warehouse about 2 hours south back in New Jersey where he'd pick up furniture for a delivery to Pennsylvania. Carl sighed. The job never really stopped. He pulled out of the hospital and headed back south on the same routes he'd just driven. Around 11:30 p.m., Carl realized something was wrong. He was driving the same roads, seeing the same landmarks, the same mile markers he'd passed earlier. But according to his GPS and his dashboard clock, he was traveling south. Yet the route looked identical to when he'd been going north. The same exits, the same bridges, the same curves in the road. Then he saw the hospital ahead of him again. The same facility he'd just left, its lights visible in the snowy darkness. Carl felt confused and disoriented. He must have gotten turned around somehow, taken a wrong exit. But his GPS showed him on the correct southbound route. This didn't make sense. He pulled into the hospital parking lot to reorient himself, to check his maps and figure out where he'd made a mistake. As he parked, a nurse approached his truck. The same nurse he'd met before, wearing the same uniform with the same expression of urgency on her face. "You're here with the medical supplies. Thank goodness. We need these urgently." Carl stared at her. "I was just here, an hour ago. I already delivered the medical supplies." The nurse looked confused. "No, you haven't been here before. This is your first delivery tonight. We've been waiting for these supplies. Please, we need them immediately." Carl got out of his truck and walked to the rear of his trailer. He opened the doors, expecting to find an empty cargo space. Instead, his trailer was full. The same pallets, the same boxes, the same medical supplies he'd just delivered were there, secured exactly as they'd been when he loaded them in New Jersey. His mind reeled. This was impossible. He'd watched the orderlies unload his trailer. He'd seen them carry the boxes into the hospital. He'd gotten a signature confirming the delivery, but somehow his cargo was back, as if the last 2 hours had never happened. The orderlies began unloading again, and Carl stood watching them, his thoughts spinning. He checked his phone, looking at the timestamp on the message from his dispatcher. It showed 7:30 p.m., the time he'd received his instructions for the next load. But his dashboard clock showed 11:45. He'd lost 4 hours somewhere, or gained them, or something had happened to his perception of time. When the unloading finished, the nurse handed him the manifest to sign. Carl looked at it closely. It was identical to the first manifest, down to the signature line where he'd signed his name. But it was blank now, as if he'd never signed it before. He signed again, his hand shaking slightly, and the nurse thanked him and disappeared into the hospital. Carl sat in his truck trying to make sense of what was happening. He'd delivered this load twice now, or thought he had. Was he hallucinating? Had he fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the first delivery? But everything felt real, solid, completely concrete. He pulled out of the hospital and headed south again, following his GPS toward the pickup location in New Jersey. He drove carefully, alert for any sign that he was looping back, that the road was somehow turning him around. But the route proceeded normally. He passed through different towns, saw different landmarks, made steady progress south. 2 hours later, he arrived at the warehouse in New Jersey and loaded furniture as instructed. His dispatcher called to confirm, and everything seemed normal. Carl didn't mention what had happened with the medical delivery. He wasn't sure how to explain it, and he was starting to doubt his own memory. Maybe he had fallen asleep, had vivid dreams. Maybe the stress and long hours were catching up to him. He completed the furniture delivery to Pennsylvania without incident, then drove to a truck stop to get rest. He slept fitly, his dreams filled with images of repeating roads, hospitals that multiplied, cargo that regenerated endlessly. The next morning, Carl received a call from his dispatcher. "Hey Carl, I've got a complaint here. The hospital in upstate New York is saying they never received the medical supplies. Did you complete that delivery last night?" Carl felt his stomach drop. "I delivered it twice," he said. I delivered it. I got a signature. The nurse confirmed receipt." "Well, they're saying their loading dock has no record of any delivery, no signed paperwork, no received supplies." "Can you check your documentation?" Carl looked through his papers. The manifest was there with his signature and the nurse's signature, dated December 2nd, 11:45 p.m. I have the signed manifest right here, he told his dispatcher. Someone signed for it. Fax it to me, the dispatcher said. I'll contact the hospital and sort this out. Carl sent the manifest, then waited anxiously for a response. An hour later, his dispatcher called back, sounding confused. Okay, this is weird. The hospital says they have no nurse on staff with that name. The signature on your manifest doesn't match anyone in their employee database, and their security cameras show your truck at the loading dock, but no unloading activity took place. You were there for about 5 minutes, then left. The cameras show your trailer doors never opened. That's impossible, Carl said. I watched them unload. It took 40 minutes. I'm looking at the timestamp footage the hospital sent, his dispatcher said. You arrived at 10:03 p.m. You parked at the dock. You sat in your truck. At 10:08, you pulled away. That's it. Nothing else happened. Carl sat in his cab, his mind unable to process this information. He remembered the delivery clearly. He remembered the nurse, the orderlies, the boxes being carried away. He remembered it happening twice. But according to security footage and hospital records, none of it had occurred. I need you to go back, his dispatcher said. The hospital still needs those supplies urgently. Real lives are at stake. Can you make another run up there today? My trailer is empty, Carl said. I delivered the cargo. I don't have anything to take to them. Carl, your truck is equipped with a GPS tracker. It shows that you're carrying approximately 18,000 pounds. Your trailer isn't empty. Whatever you think you delivered, it's still in your trailer. Carl walked to the back of his trailer and opened the doors. His cargo was there. The same medical supplies, the same pallets, the same configuration. For the third time, he was hauling this load. Or maybe he'd never delivered it at all, and his memories of the deliveries were false, implanted, or hallucinated. He drove back to the hospital, the route now sickeningly familiar. He arrived at 3 p.m. in daylight this time, and backed into the loading dock. A different nurse met him, a man in his 40s with a hospital ID badge clearly visible. You're the medical supply delivery? We've been expecting you. We've had an urgent need for these materials. Has anyone else tried to deliver this today? Carl asked. Or last night? The nurse shook his head. You're the first. We called the pharmaceutical company several times because the delivery was delayed. They assured us it was en route. Carl watched as orderlies unloaded his trailer, this time in full daylight, with multiple witnesses and security cameras running. He got the nurse's signature on the manifest, checked it against the hospital's employee database using his phone, confirmed that this was a real nurse with a verified identity. He watched the boxes being carried into the hospital's storage area, counted them to make sure the quantity matched the manifest. This time felt different. This time felt real in a way the previous deliveries hadn't. Carl couldn't articulate the difference, but he sensed it. When the unloading was complete and he pulled away from the hospital, he checked his trailer obsessively every few miles for the first hour, terrified that the cargo would somehow regenerate. But his trailer remained empty. Over the following days, Carl tried to understand what had happened. He researched temporal loops, time distortions, false memories, every paranormal or psychological explanation he could find. None of them quite fit his experience. He delivered the same load multiple times, or thought he had, but only one delivery had actually occurred in consensus reality. The most disturbing possibility occurred to him during a sleepless night, a week later. What if he was still in the loop? What if he was still making delivery attempts that didn't stick in real time? What if he'd tried to deliver this load dozens or hundreds of times, each attempt resetting, leaving no trace except in his degrading memory? How would he know if he'd escaped the loop or was still trapped in it? Carl became obsessed with documentation. He started keeping detailed logs of every delivery, every stop, every mile driven. He took photos at each location with timestamps. He called his dispatcher multiple times per shift to confirm his position and status. He was trying to anchor himself in verifiable reality, to create evidence that his experiences were real and lasting. But the doubt never fully left him. Sometimes, driving through the night on familiar routes, Carl would see a landmark and think he'd passed it before, earlier in the same trip. He'd check his logs and photos, confirm that he hadn't, but the sensation of repetition lingered. He felt unmoored from time, uncertain whether his memories of past deliveries were real or false, whether this current moment was his first experience of it, or his thousandth. Other drivers noticed the change in Carl. He'd always been quiet and professional, but now he was obsessive, almost paranoid. He refused certain loads without explanation. He wouldn't drive particular routes. When asked about it, he just said he'd had a bad experience and preferred to avoid those areas. Carl never accepted another medical delivery to that hospital. He never drove through that particular section of upstate New York again. He changed his routes to avoid it entirely, even though it meant longer trips and less efficient logistics. His company accommodated him because he was a valued driver with decades of experience, but they worried about his state of mind. Carl Henderson knows what he experienced. He delivered the same load multiple times to a hospital that claimed never to receive it. He met nurses who didn't exist. He spent hours in deliveries that security cameras showed never happened. He was caught in some kind of temporal loop or reality distortion, delivering cargo that simultaneously was and wasn't received, driving routes that led him back to where he'd already been. He doesn't know why it happened to him, whether it was something about that particular load, that specific route, that moment in time. He doesn't know if he fully escaped the loop or if he's still in it, experiencing what feels like forward progress but might be endless repetition. The uncertainty haunts him every day, every delivery, every mile. And sometimes, late at night, Carl receives calls on his cell phone from numbers he doesn't recognize. When he answers, he hears his own voice saying, "The delivery isn't complete. You need to try again. They're still waiting." He hangs up, blocks the number, but the calls keep coming from new numbers. His own voice telling him the loop isn't finished, that he needs to go back, that the hospital still needs those supplies. Carl is 57 years old with 31 years of driving experience. He has 1 million miles on his odometer, and somewhere in some version of reality, he's still trying to complete that December delivery. Still driving through snowy mountains to a hospital that will never confirm receipt, caught forever in repetition, making the same run over and over through infinite December nights. Story 10. The Final Mile. Thomas Garrett had been driving for 40 years since he was 23 years old, making him 63 now and one of the oldest active drivers still working full-time routes. He'd seen the industry transform from CB radios and paper logbooks to GPS systems and electronic logging devices. He'd driven every state in the continental U.S., logged over 4 million miles, weathered economic recessions and industry regulations and technological changes that had forced many of his contemporaries into retirement. He drove a silver 2022 Freightliner Cascadia, his company's newest truck, assigned to him in recognition of his seniority and perfect safety record. The truck was equipped with every modern amenity: collision avoidance systems, lane departure warnings, adaptive cruise control. Thomas appreciated the technology even though he'd learned to drive before any of it existed. He knew he was approaching the end of his career. His wife wanted him to retire, his back ached after long hauls, and his eyes weren't as sharp as they once were. He'd decided that the end of the year would be his last. He'd complete his final runs in December and hang up his keys forever. On December 28, 2022, Thomas picked up what would be his final load. It was a shipment of general freight from a distribution center in Memphis, Tennessee, headed for a warehouse in Portland, Oregon. It was a transcontinental run, the kind of long haul Thomas had made hundreds of times. He planned to take 5 days, driving carefully, stopping to see a few landmarks he'd always meant to visit but never had time for. This was his farewell tour, his last journey across America. He departed Memphis at dawn, watching the sun rise over the Mississippi River, the sky turning from gray to gold. Thomas felt emotional in a way he hadn't expected. These roads had been his life for 4 decades. Every mile marker held memories. Every truck stop was familiar. Every mountain pass and river crossing was part of his personal history. He was saying goodbye to all of it. The first 2 days passed in comfortable reflection. Thomas drove through Arkansas and Oklahoma, stopped at favorite diners and truck stops, talked with other drivers who'd become friends over the years. He told them this was his last run and they congratulated him, wished him well in retirement, said the roads wouldn't be the same without him. By the end of the second day, Thomas was in Colorado, parked at a rest area in the Rockies, watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and red. On the third day, as he crossed into Utah, Thomas noticed something odd. The highway ahead of him seemed to shimmer, the asphalt reflecting light in a way that didn't quite match the sun's position. He slowed slightly, checking for ice or water on the road, but the surface appeared dry and clear. The shimmer intensified as he drove through it, and for a moment, everything went white. When his vision cleared, Thomas found himself driving on a highway that looked different. The asphalt was newer, the paint lines brighter, the roads smoother. The landscape around him had changed subtly. The mountains were the same, but their colors were more vivid, the sky bluer. Everything somehow more distinct and clear, as if he were seeing the world in higher resolution than normal. His dashboard displays were blank. The GPS screen showed nothing. The speedometer read 0 even though he was clearly moving. The fuel gauge was empty even though he'd filled up 2 hours earlier. Only his steering wheel and pedals still responded to his input. Thomas was driving through a landscape that looked like Utah but felt different, otherworldly, on a highway that his instruments couldn't acknowledge. Then he saw the other trucks. They were classic rigs from decades past, models Thomas recognized from different eras of his career. A 1970s Kenworth, a 1980s Peterbilt, a 90s Freightliner, all maintained in pristine condition, all driving in the same direction he was traveling. More trucks appeared, joining from on-ramps and merging lanes until Thomas was part of a massive convoy stretching as far as he could see ahead and behind. He tried his CB radio. Static greeted him, but then a voice came through, familiar somehow, though Thomas couldn't place it. Thomas Garrett, 40 years on the road, 4 million miles. It's time for your final mile. Who is this? Thomas asked. What's happening? You're on the last highway, the voice said. Every driver finds it eventually when their time comes to leave the road forever. This is where we all go, Thomas. The final mile that never ends. Thomas looked more carefully at the trucks around him. He could see drivers now, faces visible through windshields. Some of them looked familiar, men and women he'd known during his decades of driving. People who'd retired, people who died, people who disappeared from the industry for various reasons. They were all here driving these classic trucks in an endless convoy. I'm not dead, Thomas said. I'm still alive. I'm on my last run, but I'm not dying. The last highway isn't about death, the voice explained. It's about ending. You've spent 40 years on these roads. The highway is part of you now, Thomas. You can't fully leave it. When drivers like you retire, truly dedicated drivers who've given their lives to the road, a piece of them stays here. This is that piece, your final mile. Thomas felt tears on his face. He'd known retiring would be difficult, but he hadn't expected this, hadn't understood how deeply the road had embedded itself in his identity. What happens now? He asked. Do I drive forever? You drive your final mile. the voice said. However long it takes. For some drivers, it's a few hours. For others, it lasts years. You drive until you've said goodbye to everything, until you've processed all the memories, until you're ready to truly leave. Then the highway releases you. You'll wake up in Oregon, your delivery complete, and this will feel like a dream. But you'll know it was real. You'll have made peace with leaving. Thomas looked at the convoy around him, at the classic trucks and familiar faces. He understood now. This wasn't a trap or a curse. It was a gift, a chance to say goodbye properly, to honor the life he'd lived on these highways. He settled into his seat and focused on driving. The last highway wound through impossible geography, through landscapes that merged every region Thomas had ever driven. He saw the Appalachian Mountains beside the Rockies, the deserts of the Southwest flowing into the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Great Plains touching the Atlantic coast. Every place he'd ever been, every road he'd ever traveled combined into one final route. And as he drove, memories came to him with crystalline clarity. His first day as a driver, nervous and excited, learning to shift the gears of a truck that felt enormous and uncontrollable. His first transcontinental run, the pride he'd felt delivering his load on time. The birth of his children, taking time off to be there for them, then returning to the road to provide for his growing family. The friends he'd made at truck stops, the sunrises he'd watched from his cab, the storms he'd driven through, the mechanical breakdowns and the near accidents and the small triumphs of a long career. He saw himself as a young man, as a middle-aged father, as the veteran he'd become. He saw his truck change with the decades, from basic equipment to sophisticated technology. He saw the highways evolve, watched America change through his windshield year after year. Every memory was precious, every moment of his career validated and honored by this final journey. Other drivers in the convoy waved to him as they peeled off at exits, their final miles complete, ready to return to their lives beyond the road. Thomas waved back, wishing them well. He kept driving, not ready yet to leave, still processing the weight of 40 years, still saying goodbye. He drove through days and nights that flowed together without clear boundaries. Time had no meaning on the last highway. Thomas simply drove mile after mile while his life as a trucker replayed in his mind and heart. He cried sometimes, laughed at other memories, felt gratitude and regret and pride all mixed together. Eventually, he felt the change. He'd processed everything, remembered everything, honored everything. He was ready to leave the road, ready to retire, ready for the next phase of his life. The highway ahead began to solidify, to become specific rather than universal. He was approaching Portland, returning to consensus reality, completing his actual final delivery. The shimmer appeared again, and Thomas drove through it. His dashboard displays came back online, showing normal readings. His GPS indicated he was on I-84 approaching Portland, exactly where he should be. His clock showed December 30th, 2 days after he'd entered the last highway, though it felt like he'd been driving for weeks. Thomas completed his delivery to the Portland warehouse, got his paperwork signed, and drove his truck back to his company's terminal. He turned in his keys, completed his exit paperwork, and walked away from his freightliner for the last time. He felt at peace in a way he hadn't expected. The last highway had given him closure, had allowed him to say goodbye properly to the life he'd lived. In retirement, Thomas sometimes dreams about the last highway. He sees that endless convoy of classic trucks driven by faces from his past, all traveling together through impossible landscapes. He knows that somewhere in some layer of reality that exists alongside the physical highways, drivers are still making their final miles, processing their goodbyes, honoring the lives they've lived on the road. And Thomas knows that when his actual end comes, when his life reaches its conclusion years from now, he'll return to that highway. not as a driver saying goodbye to his career, but as a spirit saying goodbye to life itself. He'll join the permanent convoy, the drivers who never leave, who watch over the highways forever. He'll become one of the guardians, one of the watchers, protecting living drivers and guiding those who need to make their final miles. But for now, Thomas Garrett is retired and at peace. He's spent 40 years on America's highways, logged 4 million miles, lived a life defined by the road. The last highway gave him the closure he needed, the farewell he deserved. And somewhere in Utah, on a stretch of highway that shimmers in certain light, that entrance to the final mile still waits. It waits for other drivers who've given their lives to the road, who need that one last journey to say goodbye, who deserve to drive their final mile in honor and memory of all the miles that came before.